Hello and welcome to the University of South Carolina Press. My name is Aaron Foley. I'm an acquisitions editor here at the Press. I'm acquiring in a number of fields, Southern Studies, Southern History, South Carolina, Civil Rights History, African American Studies, broadly construed. We are going to have an opportunity to speak with a number of authors about books that are both new and forthcoming. You'll be hearing from them. A few of those are on the table here, but I'd like to take the opportunity now to mention a few titles from authors who we didn't get a chance to speak to. One of them is Don Jelenic, has a book that I think will be of interest to a number of members and attendees of ASALH, White Lawyer, Black Power. Jelenic was a lawyer working with the ACLU and SNCC in Mississippi and Alabama in the mid-1960s, and this is a memoir of his experiences during that time, working with and helping to defend such luminaries as Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown. It's a wonderful memoir, and I think there'll be a lot to learn for many. There's also a great foreword there by the historian John Dittmer. Another here is Black Freedom in the Age of Slavery. This is by historian John Marks. It's a comparative study looking at both Charleston and Cartagena and the experience of free people of color in those two places through the Atlantic world. We also have The Child in the Electric Chair. It's a book about the execution of George Junius Stinney, a 14-year-old boy who was executed here in South Carolina in the 1940s. Challenging History. It's a series of case studies from public historians and practitioners of public history, looking at different ways that we can and have told stories about underrepresented communities to public audiences, thinking about sort of how we've done those, some of the successes and also the failures in that process. A new book from historian Stephen Lowe, The Slow Undoing, about the role of the federal courts, particularly as they played out in South Carolina, both in pushing forward movements towards desegregation and enhanced civil rights, but also as bulwarks of the old order. So there's an interesting story there to tell. This one is not a new book, but it's certainly one that will be of interest to many. This is Gullah Images. It has wonderful artwork from the artist Jonathan Greene. Also of note, Jonathan Greene will have a new book coming out with the press later this fall, so be on the lookout for that. That is Gullah Spirit. So that will be a companion title. So if you have this one already, definitely you want to be looking to get his new work coming out. And then finally, I might mention a few others. They stole him out of jail. This is a detailed history of the last lynching victim here in South Carolina, Willie Earl, who was murdered in the upstate of South Carolina. And then we have a slightly different title. It might be particularly of interest to people who are teaching courses in African American history, but 101 African Americans Who Shaped South Carolina. It's a series of short essays, many of them drawn from the South Carolina Encyclopedia, but there's also framing essays, and the individuals are divided into thematic chapters that move chronologically. So as a whole, you get a good sense of both the history of the state and particularly the role that African Americans played, the central role in pushing that history forward. So those are just a few titles here, and I think as a collective, they give a sense of the sort of work that we're looking to bring in here to the University of South Carolina Press. Hello. At this point, what we'd like to do is give you the opportunity to hear from several of our authors who have new and forthcoming books. This will be an opportunity to hear from them and share with you some of the exciting work that we have coming from the University of South Carolina Press. Hello, we're here to discuss a few books that we think will be of particular interest to members and attendees of the ASALH 2021 conference. And today I have with me Rolundus Rice, who has written a book about civil rights activist Josiah Williams. The title is Josiah Williams, A Lifetime of Defiance and Protest. It will be out from the University of South Carolina Press in January 2022. So Orlundus, thank you for joining us today. And thank you for taking a few minutes to talk about your book and about Josiah Williams. To start, I was kind of curious how you first encountered Josiah Williams and what made you feel that he was a topic that really begged for a book treatment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Foley, and thank you certainly to the press for allowing me to publish this book with you all. I certainly appreciate your consideration since our first conversations. But to answer your question, I'm a native of Atlanta, Georgia. So I was always hearing about Josiah Williams. His name was always in the Atlanta Journal. He was always in the news. And that speaks to a lot because in Atlanta at one time, you had John Lewis, you had Ralph Abernathy, you had Andrew Young, you had C.T. Vivian, and considering all those names who were active in the city at one time, and Joseph Lowry, Josiah Williams was always one to kind of stand out. And this is interesting because he and Lewis served on the Atlanta City Council together. While Andy Young was in Congress, Joseph Lowry was president of SCLC, but it was always Williams. And I never will forget it. My mother, a single mother, she would take me to the Samuel L. Jones Boys and Girls Club in East Atlanta. And we would have to pass Josiah Williams's house at 8 East Lake. And she would say, she would point, that's where old crazy Josiah Williams lives. And I know that I was not any more than about 7 or 8 years old. And that name, those memories, they always stood out to me, man. Who is Josiah Williams? Why is my mother saying he's crazy? And what was his role in Atlanta and the larger civil rights movement? So that name always stuck with me. But as I got older, studied here and studied in other places, I remember working on my dissertation perspectives, and I was going to write on another individual. And my then dissertation advisor, David Carter, he said, well, Rolandus, what are your thoughts about one of the lieutenants? And he called out some names, and it was an instant reminder for me. Let us see what's available on Hosea. And by this point, I was pretty well versed in the historiography. And I can recall looking through footnotes through various books, and I said, certainly someone has written a book on Josiah Williams because his role was outsized. But then I realized that number one, no one had written any treatments on him, and even in the literature, some very talented authors only paid scant or fragmentary attention to him in those peak years during the movement, and certainly no one really examined him prior to his involvement with the SCLC. And by that time, he was already an established civil rights figure in Savannah. So for me, the stars simply aligned. I had known of Hosea, was interested in his story as a firebrand, the one who was unbossed, unbought, and unrepentant, as I add toward the end. So I knew that if the sources would support it, he would be the one whom I would devote my dissertation to. And I can recall at my defense, the committee said, if you do this right, you can change how we teach, of course, in the civil rights movement. So here we are today with the hope that I was able to meet that very high threshold and certainly incorporate and introduce Williams to a much larger audience because of his contributions over nearly 50 years in the civil rights movement overall.
Absolutely. And we hope so as well. You mentioned a few names there, luminaries of the civil rights movement, and among them was Andrew Young. Actually, Andrew Young wrote a really excellent foreword for your book that I just loved, and I thought it was great storytelling and a great entryway into the longer narrative that you've developed. But in thinking about Young particularly, and maybe some other members within SCLC, can you maybe talk a little bit about who Josiah Williams was within the universe of SCLC and his relationships with other of King's lieutenants, Young among them.
Well, certainly, Dr. Foley. And when you talk about Hosea, it takes Dorothy Cotton to talk about Williams's relationship with other lieutenants. She would always say Williams had the biggest staff. He wanted all the money and wanted all of the control. He wanted to control his division in the way that he wanted to control it. And he was not really one for compromise. That was Andrew Young's role in the movement, as you know from the text. This whole employment of the good cop, bad cop technique that King used throughout the movement once they were together, and it worked and it was effective. Hosea was the one who would really force those recalcitrant city fathers to think twice about their current policies towards segregation or integration. And it was Andy Young who would often come up with a more conciliatory approach. And it was Young who Hosea said could talk a vulture off of a carcass, because Ambassador Young, later Ambassador Young, he just had a gift for working with different groups. But Hosea, as Dorothy Cotton says, Hosea was always being taken to staff, taken to the council within SCLC for some type of reprimand because he was bombastic. He was the bull in a china shop. He was the one who really wanted to upset the status quo in the way that he was most comfortable. I say it that way. But, Garrow has talked about it in some respects. Fairclough talked about it in some respects, and so did Taylor Branch, about those interdynamics between Williams and Belleville, Williams and Andrew Young. But I think there is one instance in particular where they were in St. Augustine, and Andrew Young talks about how he was beaten, and Hosea was always sort of calling Andrew Young the Uncle Tom, because he was the one always appealing to our white brothers and sisters in the cities. And Andrew Young took offense to that. And one time, according to the literature, they even got into a scuffle as a result. But Hosea, Andrew Young says that he loved Hosea, and I believe that Hosea also loved Andrew Young. But like brothers, they were often like brothers fighting over a contested estate. And I use that analogy because both of them were fiercely loyal to Martin Luther King Jr. Andrew Young was closer to King, and I think everyone acknowledges that. And Hosea wanted to get closer, but in that initial inner circle, it was Dr. King, Abernathy, and Andrew Young, in the, amongst the men in the movement of the civil rights movement within the SCLC. And Hosea desperately wanted to be a part of that inner brains trust. And he was. But, you hear Hosea often saying, you had to have an ego to be in this business. And they all had egos. Dorothy Cotton said that it was King who had the ability to, quote, tame the wild horses, unquote. So they were all wild horses, but under King's leadership, he was able to keep them working together, keep the egos at bay, while also working toward the much larger mission. And we saw this dynamic play out even after SCLC, when Hosea was a city councilman and later state legislator, while Andrew Young was mayor of Atlanta. They were usually on opposite sides. Hosea will want Andrew Young to take more radical approaches, for instance, with police brutality, and Andrew Young, the seasoned diplomat, would take a more refined approach that brought more people to the table. So, but like brothers, they had disagreements, and they had them often. And that is the result of, again, their background. Hosea grew up in an environment to where he was not in the middle class. Andrew Young, his father was a dentist. Andrew Young, of course, goes to Howard. Jose Williams goes to Morris Brown and then Atlanta University for a moment. So they were both educated, both handsome, both very intelligent, both very driven men. And when you had those dynamics, you are bound to have individuals who are going to bump heads. And that was no different between Andrew Young and Hosea Williams. So, and I do hope that the readers will get a sense of the love-hate relationship, and those are Andrew Young's words, when they read the latter portions of this book.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rolandus, for talking with us today a little bit about your book. I think it really comes through both your passion for the subject and your knowledge for the subject in you talking here. It'll come through even more when people pick up the book and read. I think everyone, whether they're specialists in the field or people with a more casual understanding, there's something for everyone in this book, and anyone is going to gain a lot of insight and knowledge from the work that you have done. And I think the members of ASALH will be quite pleased, I think, when they pick it up. And again, that's out January 2022. It's Josiah Williams, A Lifetime of Defiance and Protest, from the University of South Carolina Press. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Foley.
Hi, we are here today with Eric Crawford. He is the author of a book, Gullah Spirituals, The Sound of Freedom and Protest in the South Carolina Sea Islands, just out from the University of South Carolina Press, and we're very happy to be able to talk to Eric today. Eric, one of the really interesting things I thought about this book is the sort of research and the methodology that you used in developing it. You weren't just in the archives, but you actually did field work on the island. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about that field work and some of the people that you met in the course of doing it.
Indeed, yes. I began this quest having a master's student, Marianne Rice, and she was doing this thesis on Gullah music. And so I had never heard the word Gullah before, and I became intrigued. And so as I began to investigate, I saw that it was a fundamental culture in terms of, I think it was spirituals, food, all the above. And hearing these songs and seeing these songs, nobody knows the troubles I've seen or Row Jordan Row, and how they came from this central place, St. Helena Island. And so I did my research, I would do the archival research, but then I became fascinated with going down to the island to determine if anyone's still sang these songs. And so thus I began going down there.
Great. And you talk a little bit about it in the book, or quite a bit about it in the book, but who were the people that were keeping this tradition alive there on the island?
Right. As I went down to the island, I was there probably for a few months, and then people would say, well, you must go to the praise house. And so, which is a small structure where they would still holding these services that untraced back to slavery times. And so I began to find singers such as Deacon James Garfield Smalls, who just passed away at 100 years old, and Gracie Gatson and the Murrays. And they were singing these songs that they learned from their grandmothers. And they're in their 80s. And so they were touching upon that period of time that was central to my own work. And so that's how I came across. And of course, as I heard these songs, they were traced back to a very important document, Slave Songs of the United States, 1867, which is the starting point for Negro spirituals. And again, of those 136 songs, 77 come from St. Helena Island, and it is sort of our beginning point.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I think those stories that you tell, both sort of about the past, but also bringing it up, into the present, gives a lot of power to the book. Thinking about that, the subtitle here, The Sound of Freedom and Protest, and you talk about the ways these songs have been used and deployed by different groups, but thinking about maybe where we are now, Are these songs, are these spirituals still relevant in our own time?
Good question. You know, I think spirituals are still performed by many choirs, church choirs, school choirs. They've been sort of they've been probably cleaned up a bit now. They're standard English, or they'll add instrumentation. But these songs, you know, served us during the slavery period, civil rights period, and the question for me is, once these older singers stop singing these songs, will they still survive? And what I found, you know, is that I've had my own students, those when I was at Coastal Carolina University, who would record these songs and add their own spin to these songs. And and just seeing how they found such enjoyment from this music, you know, which is really, you know, it will definitely invoke you to move your feet, or tap your feet, or to clap. And also seeing that today, you know, as you hear rap songs and how they cleverly can manipulate words and spin words, which dates back to the old codes in slave songs. And you will hear in hip hop that low beat that's always present, which of course now goes back to when they were stomp and clap and have that bass and rhythm, that sound there. And so, though it's not called Negro spirituals, remnants are still here.
Great. Well, good. I think the members and attendees of ASALH will be quite interested in this book. Again, that's Skull of Spirituals, The Sound of Freedom and Protest in the South Carolina Sea Islands, available from USC Press in print, ebook, and actually this one also available as an audiobook if you want to go that route. So thank you, Eric, for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Hello, I am here this afternoon with June Manning Thomas. Dr. Thomas has written a book, Struggling to Learn: An Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. It's a little bit of a hybrid project. There's memoir, there's history, but there's a whole lot of depth, information, and perspective. I think that members and attendees of ASALH will be very interested in reading. It'll give you, I think, a different view of the desegregation of schools in South Carolina, the civil rights movement in South Carolina, especially in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And with that, I'll maybe turn it over to June and ask you, June. You know, you've had a long career. You've written other books. What made you want to write your story in this book at this time?
Yeah, well, I actually had plans to write that book for many years. I think my first notes were back in 1997. So this was a long delayed project. And for some reason, I always found an excuse, another book to write or something else to do. But I'd say I always wanted to write it. Time was running out if I was going to write it. And something marvelous happened, which was I discovered archives, that there had been people keeping archives. So I had been worried because my own memories were fading, but then I discovered that historians had been keeping records of much of life during that era.
Great. What were a few of the I guess those archives that were helpful for you in developing this book?
So one of them was the University of South Carolina, which I never would have expected to keep records of the civil rights movement, but it did. I was still thinking back to 50 years ago when University of South Carolina was a white school. So I was not thinking of them as a collector of records, but they were keeping excellent records, not only of civil rights actors in our state, but also the opponents. And I wanted to write a story that talked about the opponents of civil rights and school desegregation, as well as the proponents. The college where much of the action takes place, Claflin College, had also been keeping records. Ironically, I had donated some of them years ago after I was going through my parents' effects. And so various libraries and archives such as that.
Great, great. Yeah, and it may be worth mentioning too, sort of a little bit about your background and your family's background. You mentioned Claflin. I mean, you have, and your family has a deep association with that institution. Can you maybe just let people know, if they don't know, kind of what that connection is?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure to highlight the, excuse me, the role of students in particular at Claflin, what was then Claflin College, in the civil rights movement. And I had a very good vantage point for doing so. My father was president of that college for most of my childhood and a good deal of my young adulthood. My mother was a faculty member there. I lived on campus. So I actually had a firsthand view of the activities that were taking place in the 1950s and 1960s. So one of the goals was to talk about how colleges such as Claflin and how Blacks in general had educated their children and their youth, even in the midst of Jim Crow. So I used the story of Claflin University as an example of that, that great constructive resilience that the Black community had shown in educating its own.
Wonderful. And, you know, I always think of the writing process not only as a process of kind of telling the things we already know, but maybe even more than that, a learning process in itself of organizing thoughts. And I think you always kind of know more by the end of writing something than you did at the beginning somehow. I wondered, in this process of telling such a personal story, did you have a similar experience? Did you learn, or what did you learn in the course of doing this project?
I learned a lot about the people who were associated with the school desegregation process, but not necessarily visible to me or to the other children who desegregated those first schools. So, for example, 13 of us desegregated the local high school in Orangeburg in 1964, but I had no idea there were other people that included the NAACP, but other organizations as well, that had been working to ease that path, in addition to lawyers, of course, that had been working to ease that path and to make sure that we were safe when we went to those places. The other thing I learned was I understood more about the peonage system and the Jim Crow system because I was in a fairly prosperous island in Orangeburg, but the depth of the denigration that took place, particularly in terms of the public education system, I should have known this because I had many clues, but it just was so much worse than I had realized. And so that was just one glimpse into the negative effects of Jim Crow on Blacks in the South.
Great. Well, I think everyone, when they pick up this book, they're going to have something, and they're going to have a process of learning as well. That's scholars of the period who know it well, the public, maybe some who know it well, some who maybe only have a passing knowledge, and really all readers are going to be able to pull material here, and I think are going to gain some new perspective. So again, that is Struggling to Learn: An Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. June Manning Thomas is the author. It'll be out in January 2022. Thank you, June, again, for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Hello, we are here today to talk with a couple of authors working with our press. They have a really exciting new book that is coming out in November of this year. Robert Greene II, Tyler D. Perry. They've edited a collection called Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina, offering a really important exploration of some of this background history. And in fact, I'll start there and ask sort of what was the process by which this book developed and came to be?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with just a very brief background. Robert and I were part of the commemorations committee back in about 2013 when they were doing the 50-year anniversary of the 1963 desegregation, and attached to that was also the 1873 desegregation as well. And we were grad students at the time. A committee was formed led by Valinda Littlefield, who was the program director of African American Studies at the time, who also generously provides a foreword to our book, kind of explaining that process. And, you know, all of the grad students who were recruited as researchers worked very hard on their projects, but we essentially wrote these papers, presented them publicly, but there was never anything done with any of the pieces. And Robert and I had stayed in contact after grad school, and there was this looming need and desire amongst both of us to kind of see these brought to the public, and that this broader narrative of how African Americans have contributed to the campus life is something that the general U of SC student just doesn't know. And we thought that that needed to change, and we thought this volume could be a step forward in that process.
And just to add to that, you know, we've seen books from other universities that have also talked about the experience of African Americans at those schools. So Tyler and I felt that South Carolina has a particularly unique story that needed to be brought to light, not just for students and faculty at U of SC, but to folks in South Carolina, across the South, and across the nation. And so for us, this project was about bringing these papers to light, but also entering into a conversation that's taking place nationally about the place of people of color, especially African Americans, at the university in the United States.
Yeah, and you mentioned that national conversation, and that's absolutely true. You see this at a number of universities. But thinking also, again, back to our campus community here at U of SC, I think it's particularly timely. We've just had a report, a President's Commission report, thinking about especially the names and the sort of commemoration and the type of people we are commemorating on our campus here. And I wondered how this volume might help to contribute to and maybe move forward that conversation that's going on right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'll just start by talking about actually the final half of the book first, because I know Tyler is really much more familiar with the first half of the book. And really the second half of our volume, Invisible No More, deals with the Black experience at U of SC in the 20th century going into the 21st century. And so we have chapters about early attempts to desegregate the university before 1963 that most folks probably aren't aware of. Talking about the actual desegregation moment in 1963. And then I think this is where our volume is unique, talking about the Black experience after desegregation. With traditional civil rights narratives, the story is segregation and then desegregation, and that's it. Instead, I think folks will read this volume and realize there is a much longer process. In fact, one could argue that desegregation, in a sense, is still taking place at U of SC right now in different ways. And the final chapter actually gets into memorialization, commemoration on campus, and how we have thought about these issues over the last few years, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think that one of the primary concerns with this volume, and you can see this chapter by chapter, is that every author from beginning to end is concerned about names. And so when we talked about the title, went back and forth on different things, Invisible No More just really seemed to speak to the essence of what we were trying to get at, in that if you look at Graham Duncan's chapter on enslaved people on campus, the way he actually ends that chapter is he lists the names of all known enslaved people on the campus. And so one of the pushes that we think this volume can make is that there is no excuse why these individuals should not be known by the campus community, but also the state community writ large. So one of the primary contributions is this really detailed narrative that African Americans never disappear from the campus and the campus life, even after segregation is formalized throughout the U.S. South. They're always there, they're always present, and we have a number of chapters that demonstrate how that process unfolds. And so we are really excited to also just introduce readers to the names of these individuals and their contributions to both the university and the state and the nation.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Robert and Tyler, for talking to me a little bit more about this book, and to all of the members and attendees of ASALH 2021. Again, the book is Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina. It'll be on sale November 2021 in both paperback and hardcover. You can get it through our website and any booksellers. But again, thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, we have with us today Kevin Mitchell. Kevin is one of the authors of a book that will be out in the fall, in October of 2021. It is a book we're really excited about, and we think members and attendees of ASALH will be excited about it as well. That is Taste the State, South Carolina's Signature Foods, Recipes, and Their Stories. And I have with me today Kevin Mitchell. Kevin, thank you so much for speaking with me this afternoon. Maybe just by way of introduction, could you tell the viewers a little bit about your background?
Well, yeah, I am currently a chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston, located in Charleston, South Carolina. I've been an instructor here for about 13 years. My background, I am, classically trained chef. I have 2 degrees from the Culinary Institute of Charleston, Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. So I have my associate's degree in culinary arts, my bachelor's degree in management, and recently, back in 2018, received my master's degree at the University of Mississippi in Southern Studies, where I focused in on Southern foodways, Southern food culture, the revitalization of Southern ingredients, and then, for me, my own personal interest and passion in discovering, the history of African Americans in cooking.
Great. Well, I think there's some hints in there for viewers, maybe in the title and in what you've just said. But when readers do get their hands on this book and they pick up Taste the State, what will they find there?
Oh, they'll find an array of, just like the title says, an array of stories that relate to South Carolina ingredients and or specific dishes. Of course, there'll be some photos of some of the ingredients, definitely photos of some of the dishes that I actually cooked at home and photographed at home. And they'll find some recipes, and those recipes will kind of date back to late 1800s, and then also kind of counterbalancing those recipes with some that are more contemporary, things that were written by me personally. And also there are some other recipes that we included that were granted to us so graciously to feature in the book. One comes to mind. We were able to have the Lee brothers grace us with the recipe for boiled peanuts, because we write about peanuts in the book. And we also, write about, once again, a bunch of ingredients. So you'll be reading stories about okra. You'll be reading stories about purloo and what it means to not only this area of Charleston as it relates to the Gullah culture, but, South Carolina as a whole. And then there are actually some products that are, made right here in the state of South Carolina. One comes to mind is Blenheim Ginger Ale, which was something new for me to discover as we were writing this book.
Oh, yeah, I just picked up the 6-pack of Blenheim recently.
Did you get the red or the gold?
The gold.
The gold. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And so some of these, that you've already mentioned will be familiar to readers. Probably many of them might be kind of different or surprising. Is there one that stands out to you, maybe as particularly interesting or surprising?
Yeah, there were some ingredients that actually David kind of stumbled upon the history of as Tanya root, yapong tea, things that were definitely new to me. As many people know me, I'm not originally from South Carolina. I grew up in New Jersey, and then of course throughout my travels, make my way to Charleston about 13 years ago. So not only was this book was a really great exercise for me to write, but it was also a great exercise for me to learn more about some of these ingredients and some of these things that I had no clue of.
Excellent. Well, good. I think that's a nice place to end it. And I think, readers, again, out this October, when they pick up this book, they'll have a lot to find there and a lot to learn and be introduced to. So thank you, Kevin, for talking this afternoon. And we're all very excited about this project.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm here with author Claudia Smithinson. She has a book that I think will be of great interest to the members and participants in ASALH 2020. It is Stories of Struggle, the Clash over Civil Rights in South Carolina. I have it here in my hand. It's a beautiful jacketed hardcover. It's available now anywhere where you get books. And we have a great opportunity to talk to Claudia this afternoon a little bit about this project. And that's kind of where I'd like to start, Claudia, is, the book here, Stories of Struggle. And you have these wonderful stories about groups and people in South Carolina. Where were some of the places where you found these stories and these people?
When I came to South Carolina, one of the things I noticed right away was that people were saying, "Thank God for Mississippi." And this was a little joke that white people would say, and they would laugh about it. And what they meant was that South Carolina, on all the worst statistics, it's at the bottom, but it's not 50. It's 48 or 47. And I thought, why is this celebrated? This is so odd. And so within a few years, I persuaded my editors to let me write solely about poverty. And as I was traveling the state, talking to people, I was, of course, interviewing both white and black people. And I should point out here that there's sort of an inherent racism in that "thank God for Mississippi" attitude, because white people were identifying deep poverty as black, but of course blacks were in the minority in South Carolina, and so numerically, the majority of people who were poor were white. I was going into white and black communities, and I started meeting many activist black elders, and I quickly started wondering why I didn't know about them. And when I would take their names back to the newspaper, which had been functioning since the 1800s as a white-owned newspaper, they were not people who had been written about. And so I started asking people for their stories. And some of them just haunted me. One was a man named Mr. McCain, who was trying to register to vote and then get a mass of people to get someone on the voter registration board. And when he was opposed, he told me this story about showing up with a few people for an important meeting. And immediately half the white people left to go phone and get other white people there. And he said, literally, white people were coming out of the woods. They were coming out of the woods in their house slippers and curlers in their hair to stop black people from influencing the vote. So there were little stories like that that had a lot of power. And I started thinking about how important it was if we were going to understand South Carolina, to have those stories that weren't told. So as a journalist, I started making a point of interviewing people that were elderly and important and soon were going to be gone. And their stories would be lost when they were gone. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One was that there had not been a Black-owned newspaper in South Carolina since 1954. The white-owned newspapers were heavily white supremacist. They would put the White Citizens Council statements on their front page, not even as editorials, just as fact. And so there was a version of the civil rights era, but it was a white supremacist version. And another reason that we don't know these stories is that they're very painful stories often. And so sometimes people were telling me stories that they had not told their children or even their wives. Another Mr. McCain, James T. McCain, who was the first Black field secretary for CORE in the South and focused on voter registration and then became key to training students in nonviolent direct action, was almost unknown by his children because he traveled so much in his dedication to both those efforts. So that's another reason that the stories aren't told. So that reinforced for me how important it is to find these stories and not to rely on something that I reject, which is the great man narrative, that there's one man accomplishing everything, because there are heroes everywhere. And it is inspiring and important to know their stories because I truly believe almost any ordinary person can step up and make a difference in the world if they choose to. And these were people, I think of them as they get up in the morning and they're going to be a carpenter or clean someone's house. This is the 40s and 50s and 60s, keep in mind. They're restricted in service jobs. And they get up in the morning and they know the dangers that are out there and they know their constitutional rights. And they know that if they go work for their constitutional rights, they may not come home, they may not live through the day. And yet they go and do it. They go and sit at a lunch counter, they go picket, they go register to vote. They do these amazing things that make this nation a better place. And they deserve to be known.
Yeah. I think that's a great point and an interesting one, too. You mentioned sort of challenging that great man sort of narrative of history, that sort of individual-driven narrative. I mean, it makes me think of a couple of stories in the book, maybe sort of the Briggs case and some of the people in Somerton, South Carolina, who were influential there, the Charleston hospital worker strike a little bit later on. Can you talk about maybe some of those stories and a few of the people who you found in those places, maybe who have been a little bit less known or sort of behind some of the more well-known figures in the movement?
Oh, I'd love to. So when people hear the story of Briggs versus Elliott, they often hear it in terms of Reverend J.A. Delane. And Reverend Delane was a preacher and an educator in Somerton, South Carolina. Many of the leaders in the NAACP were ministers, and there are a variety of reasons for this. They're more likely to be educated. They are less likely to be murdered, and they also are not going to be fired by those they work for, their congregation. And so Reverend Delane was wont to write letters to J. Edgar Hoover, for example, when there was a murder that wasn't investigated, to the Department of Justice when the GI Bill rights were denied. He was a very active and public figure, and as a consequence, his house was burned down. The KKK burned down his church in an effort called Operation Shoot 'Em Up to get him out of Lake City after his bishop transferred them. And he escaped South Carolina, barely with his life, and to New York, where there was a refusal to extradite him. So it's a cinematic story. It's an amazing story. And he was an incredibly brave person. But he was gone, and Briggs versus Elliott continued. And so Reverend James Seals, who was thought of sort of as his co-pilot, he stayed and he kept promoting Briggs versus Elliott and the petitioners, although his house was burned and his hog farm out in the country was destroyed. He was raising a grandson, and his grandson and his wife went to New York to be safe, and he continued. Or Mary Oliver, there are multiple petitions, and they began with 106 petitioners and then narrowed down, they being the NAACP and the local activists, to slightly more than 40 adults and children. And the reason for the narrowing down was when they saw how harsh the repercussions were. Death threats, the arsons I've mentioned, being fired from your job, having your relatives threatened and fired. It was just endless, the consequences. They narrowed down to people who could sustain the damage and to enough people, as I said, more than 40, that they would still have a lawsuit if some of those people had to leave town. So you have people who are signing more than one petition. Mary Oliver signed every one of them. Her husband died in the meantime, and when she signed the last one that became a lawsuit that asked for desegregation and went to the Supreme Court, some of her friends said, "Why are you still signing the lawsuit? Why are you doing this?" And she said of her husband, she said, "I promised him I'd be a woman." I love that. You know, in other words, she's going to be an adult, and she was going to do what all these petitioners did, which was understand that they were at risk and that they weren't going to be rewarded themselves personally, and perhaps even their children weren't going to profit, but they were going to persevere. And so these are people that I want people to know about, because they're so wonderful, and they're a reminder that if you understand what your rights truly are, and you want to be a full citizen. The president of the state conference in NAACP, James Hinton, called it first-class citizenship. You've got education, you've got a vote. Then perhaps with that knowledge and that determination, you step up and, as I said before, understanding you may not directly benefit, but investing in the future. And I think that's pretty noble.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think that definitely comes through. There are a lot of heroes here, and just the nature of change, I think too, is a great lesson sort of to take from this book, and sort of how change happens and where it comes from. But again, that book is Stories of Struggle: The Clash Over Civil Rights in South Carolina. Claudia, thank you so much for talking with us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for spending time with us here at the University of South Carolina Press. If you have a project or idea and want to continue this conversation, you can reach me by email. You can also visit our website at uscpress.com. There you'll find information about how to submit manuscripts and proposals, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.